So welcome to our community. We're called Design for Impact, but we'll do a quick introduction. First, we want to bring lots of insights. Just a quick introduction of us. We're a community called Design for Impact. And basically what brings us together is using our skills to make a difference. There's quite a few of us around the world. You'll meet some of us today. We're about 487 change makers and counting from 21 countries, and our designers have won lots of different awards. And I use sort of the term design loosely because I think some people like Kyle and I, for example, have a more complexity social design bend, and some people are focused on UI, product design, UX, that type of design. But I think we actually have a really good mix of people that work for government, people that work for not-for-profits, and people that work for commercial companies as well, which I think is part of the diversity that our community has, which is amazing. So I might have mentioned that my name is Abram. I'm the founder of Design for Impact, and the job that pays the bills is I'm a senior designer at Fjord, working actually pretty closely with government in Australia. Awesome. So 2 rules of play. I don't know how you're going to feel about this, but if you can, turn your cameras on and be present as much as possible. So that helps us engage and get to know one another. And we found that when people are as present as possible, when they get to know each other as much as possible, it helps you get the most out of the session. So yeah, just a friendly reminder to do that. And if you've got sounds or different things in the background, family, dogs, whatever it is, feel free to include them into the session. We're always happy. It's nice seeing. Okay, so I sent the Miro board link, but I want to start with a quote by Nelson Mandela, and it really stands out to me. And Nelson Mandela says, "There is no passion to found playing small and settling for a life that is less than the one that you are capable of." And I feel like this rallies a lot of designers, because I think a lot of us, especially probably in this room, came to design or want to use design in some way to make a difference, to have an impact, to change someone's life, which I think, like Terence said, it's an absolute privilege to have that ability or have that opportunity to actually make a difference. And yeah, we always try to be mindful of that. So one of the concepts I want to introduce to you is the idea of this elephant. And basically, imagine there's this Indian parable idiom that talks about a few blind men and an elephant, and each blind man is trying to touch, or blind woman is trying to touch a part of the elephant and trying to figure out what the elephant is based on it. For example, you can see this guy, he's holding onto the elephant's tail and saying it's a rope. This guy holding onto the elephant's trunk, I think that's trunk, and saying it's a snake, and so on and so forth. Or this person holding onto the leg and thinking it's a tree. And I think that's a bit of what working in complex systems is like. When we're biased and we just see things from our own worldview, it's very difficult to understand what that thing is. We become like the blind man. But when we bring different people together that look at the system and understand the system from different angles, then we start to understand that it's an elephant. Any questions about anything to do with this idiom or how it's relevant, or even reflections? Would love to hear from you. Seeing some smiles, some confused looks. Any thoughts? Should I pick? I'll pick Melissa. What do you think about this?
I don't know what to say. Like, I agree. I don't know. Just.
All right, Moses, any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. When different people share their perspective on how they look at a particular problem, it's closer to tap into the wisdom of the crowd, if I could use that term.
Yeah, so sort of collective intelligence, like like you say, there was. All right, don't worry, by the way, this session's not going to, and you're reflecting on what I say, we're going to have lots of group conversations, but it's a few quotes to help us frame complex systems or complex problems. So Donella Meadows, in one of her books, she says how a system is a set of related components that work together in a particular environment to perform whatever functions are required to achieve the system's objectives. And I think often one reflection on that is often we think about a system's objective, say the healthcare system, we think about the system's objective might be something really altruistic, like taking care of people or taking care of people that have health issues. And I think sometimes actually when you go into the systems, you realize that that's not the system's objective. Because if that was the system's objectives, then it would be doing really good at that. Like a car's objective is to get you from from A to B, and the car is actually really good at that. But when you engage with systems, sometimes the effect that you think the system should have isn't necessarily the one it has. I'll talk a bit more about that. And coming back to the idea of the elephant, or Draper Kaufman talks about the idea of a cow. Dividing the cow in half doesn't give you two smaller cows. And this is the problem and also the thing that's exciting and interesting about complex systems is if you just break down the system into smaller parts, it doesn't give you smaller issues to deal with. You actually lose that essential characteristic of the cow or the living system or the forest or the health system or whatever it is you're trying to impact. And this is what we mean when we say a system functions as a whole, right? You can't just look at a part of the system in isolation and say, okay, what's this part trying to do versus what's that part trying to do. And the behavior of the system actually depends on the entire structure. And this is what we're going to be trying to visualize a bit today. Kyle, in your reflection.
Yeah. So this is something that we can call this reductionism or atomism versus, I'm going to throw some big words around every once in a while. I apologize in advance. Ontological entanglement. And here's a great example. A car, if you were to take the car apart, you could easily put it back together. And the car is going to be the car, which is the sum of all of its parts. It always is. And it's simple because it comes apart and it goes back together and it functions the same way. That's reductionism or atomism. But in a complex system where we have that ontological entanglement, meaning that the definition of what the car is not just dependent on the car itself, but the system that it's in. As soon as you put the car on the road, the way that it behaves, the way that the driver behaves, is not purely independent of itself. It's now entangled with how traffic works, how other drivers are working, how the road works, how the weather works. There are other agents working with the driver to define what that car is at that given moment.
Excellent. Thanks, Kyle. Yeah, any thoughts or questions or reflections on that? Feel free to unmute. We're a pretty friendly bunch, if I say so myself.
Okay, so I have one question related to what Kyle just said. So would it be somewhat accurate to say that reductionism is a type of abstraction, while ontological entanglement is more when that abstraction is put into practice, how it functions in the real world?
That's a tough one. I don't know that I would call it an abstraction, but I would say that something that is, this is a bit of a rabbit hole. So human engineered systems that are highly ordered, like a car itself, are causal and linear in nature, which is why it becomes atomic and you can take it apart and put it back together. It's intentionally built that way, where there's not one human that has the agency to determine the order, linearity, or causality of traffic as a whole. However, if we think about the ordered systems that are created by humans, they're coming from complex systems. And so we tend to think of ordered systems or these ordered atomic components as being sterile and functional, but they're actually products of or catalyzed from human systems. And so if you have a deficient human system or a problematic human system, a system with bias, for example, it's going to create biased products. It's going to create products with the same issues that the human system has itself. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, good question, Terence. That's really interesting. I agree with Kyle. I wouldn't call it an abstraction when you're breaking things down. In my head, I think of abstraction as like zooming up and looking at the thing in the context, as opposed to zooming into the car and seeing how the tire works with the wheel, for example. Any other questions or reflections? We're going to get into group work fairly soon. Okay. All right. So to position this sort of idea of complexity thinking, there's usually three different types of ways to approach a problem that people refer to. One is complexity thinking, which is that idea of zooming out and looking at how the traffic works with the rules, works with the government, etc. Design thinking, which is that idea of zooming into someone's human experience, right? Understanding how that person feels about it and what led them to that position and how they would want the problem to be solved, which I think a lot of you will be familiar with. And then analytical thinking, that idea of if I just, like someone said, I think they come from computer science, that idea of if I just break down the problem, in a specific way, I'll be able to solve each part of the problem separately and then combine it together. So these are three different types of approaches. We're going to break out into groups. So usually we break out into groups of 5 or 6 people. So we're going to do that now for about 5 minutes. And we want you to consider what are the advantages and disadvantages of a complexity thinking approach. Okay, that's like the prompting question. And you will find it in Miro. Does everyone have access to Miro?
Yes, I do.
Okay, cool. Does anyone not have access to Miro?
I don't use Miro. I use Moro.
Okay.
Sorry, but I can follow the group.
Yeah, cool. I just put the link for you in the chat as well, so feel free to sign up.
Thank you.
All right, awesome. All right, so yeah, again, we'll go for about 5 to 7 minutes. Just get to know each other as a group and start to consider what are the advantages and disadvantages of this type of thinking and approach to problems. Any questions before we break out? Okay, rooms are open. Hello, that was awesome. I jumped into a couple of different sessions and that was great. And look at that, most people have the cameras on. Awesome. Keen to hear from a few different people about how that went and what your group thought, like points of disagreement, like an advantage for a complex thinking approach is, and someone else thought it was a disagreement. So yeah, just unmute, and I don't want to call names, but yeah, just unmute and share your thoughts.
I think for our group, we had a conversation on what examples of these complex thinking systems are, because I personally had a hard time wrapping my head around the concept, clearly knowing what the advantages would be for depending on the role that you're in for your process. But basically everything that we talked about was covered in what's now in Miro. How one of the disadvantages I thought of was going into a black hole of all these things that you need to consider. Let's say you're in a sprint process and you need to execute a solution relatively quickly. Yeah, that design thinking is advantageous, but when you have a deadline to meet or something like that, you would probably need to find balance and not spend too much time viewing your process through that lens.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Jeff, a few people said that around the idea of like design thinking, I think feels a lot more action oriented for people. Like in the sprint, we're going to deliver X, Y, Z. Whereas I think with complexity thinking, people, at least when they start, get the idea that you need to do a lot of like analysis work in order to get to a useful picture of the system. And then you start to act based on that. So that's, interesting. Also, who else wants to stay quiet until someone unmuted? Yeah, Moses.
Yeah, in my group, initially we a little bit of back and forth trying to actually understand what complexity thinking is, because I think all of us were lost at the point during the initial explanation. But someone helped us with sort of like a definition. And one of the things I got to pick out from complexity thinking, especially in aspects of the advantages, is because of the scope of the approach, it encourages you against being predictable or relying on assumptions, to say.
Yeah. So yeah, like you said, like uncovering this in complexity thinking, because you're bringing a big group of people around the table, or now a virtual table or Zoom, you're uncovering those assumptions when people disagree on different things. Awesome. Thanks, Moses. Any other thoughts? Maybe one or two more people? Should I pick? All right, Kate, pick another Aussie.
Yeah, no, it was quite interesting to think about, and I related a lot to it because I work in government, so we deal with lots of complex problems. yeah, the advantages are that you don't forget about other aspects, not just the end user. If you're designing an app or something, you think about the business side of things and industry, so lots of different parties. But sometimes I've found you can get stuck in all the edge cases and not come to a conclusion because you're stuck in the analysis. Yeah.
Not really a burning desire to share, but I think for our group as well, I think complexity itself wasn't, I guess we didn't really have a shared definition of complexity. So that was a lot difficult, but I think what we did agree on was that we were, through complexity thinking, we would be able to look at the whole system versus on design thinking, it's more focused on the end user. So I guess it's an advantage and a disadvantage at the same time. Like the solution could create more impact. For example, now that I'm thinking about, let's say Uber as a design thinking project, like solve one problem for the user, but with thinking system, like the system-wide transportation as a complex system, then it's potentially create a lot of impact, but it's not all advantageous. There's a lot of disadvantages that create as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of this book that I've been reading today. It's called Systems Change, and it talks about, I'm gonna like skim over the specifics, but it's basically this agricultural program that the US set in motion for Mexico initially, and they aim to basically cheapen crops and make them more effective. And so therefore, the goal was to feed more people, and to, even if you're poor, you can still eat. And even though they made the crops really cheap, like crops like wheat and maize and things like that, they made them really cheap. They actually put out a lot of farmers out of jobs, because they, all of a sudden, those farmers that were planting these crops, they had to sell their product for a lot cheaper. And so what ended up happening is you had these few, really rich companies who would hire all those farmers that would lose their livelihoods to farm for them and pay them a lower wage. So even though the goal was to feed a lot of people, they didn't consider, by making crops cheaper and produce a lot more sort of bang for the buck, they actually put out a lot of farmers and things like that, and basically destroy the farming industry. And then that happened not just in Mexico, in Africa and other places like that. Yeah, it's interesting how you can create something and not understand the potential consequences of it until you put it into motion. Awesome. Kyle, any
What was that book
thoughts?
called?
Systems Change. I'll share a quote from it right after Kyle talks.
Yeah, so a couple of quick anecdotes that might help flesh this out. There's, when we were talking about ordered systems versus complex systems, it's really about identifying what system you're in and how to act in it. And so a really good example of getting that wrong is Chernobyl. In Chernobyl, they didn't really account for the human factor, that people were going to be operating this place. And so they just had very rigid instructions, and they trained everybody in very rigid processes. One day, one of the lead operators decided to delay an exercise by about 8 hours, and it changed the environment that they were in to a point that nobody knew how to respond anymore. They were totally left without the ability to improvise and use intuition, because they were so trained into this rigid space that they just went through their process normally, and the combination of the two created the Chernobyl meltdown and all of the awful impacts after that. Another good example, and this is a positive one, it just happened. I've been really excited about this. The article was just posted in Time last weekend. So Hurricane Katrina 2005, New Orleans is completely underwater. The Army Corps of Engineers goes in and rebuilds the levee system. And the way that they do this is the 100-year storm model, which basically says what is the worst case scenario that might be a 1% chance of happening in all of our modeling. But that modeling uses past data. Now, they understood in this case that they were in a complex system. Not only that, but again, the human element comes in. The Army Corps of Engineers that designed the fix were also the ones that were cleaning up. And they talk about in this article, remembering the human impact of cleaning dead bodies out of these buildings, seeing like people's belongings destroyed and floating in waters and everything else. And that just affected them to a point where they didn't want to build the minimum viable solution to protect New Orleans the second time around, or when this happened again. So rather than using a model for this 1%, based on past data, knowing that climate change is happening and the models aren't going to work, they built for uncertainty. And so they built this sort of modular, we can build things up much faster and stronger. Actually, the reason they did, or because they did that, New Orleans is not underwater today. If they hadn't done that and they went with the original 1% model, it would have been 2 feet too short and the levees would have broken and New Orleans would be in the same exact situation today that it was in 2005 after Katrina, because Ida was that bad. To the point of, we don't really know what happens when this stuff gets in the wild. They built these amazing levees around New Orleans. New Orleans is now safe, but it also funneled the river downstream, and the impact to the people in the rural areas and the farms down south in the Mississippi River were impacted that much heavier. And so that's the consequence of intervening in a complex system too, is you have to take ownership ethically of all of your interventions. But knowing that they were working in uncertain space is what saved.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. I love your stories. Just love them. All right. So we're gonna jump into the next exercise as well, but this one's gonna be a bit longer and probably a bit harder for people. But one quote I do want to share is, I think some people spoke about the idea of like analysis paralysis. And people are right. There's sort of two different types of approaches of visualizing complexity. One, like Cynthia and Francois talk about systems work of social change. Sophia, I think it was you asking about the book, so that's the book. They talk about how we can choose different approaches, and people actually apply these approaches. It's not to say that one of them is more helpful than the other, but personally, I like the one that I'll show you today. So we can build models that incorporate complexity to the finest degree possible, and those are typically like computerized models, right, where they add the variables in and try to map the system live, and that takes a lot of work, right? Because the aim of that is to narrow our risk of uncertainties so much. We have so much complexity in the system that we're trying to narrow our risk of uncertainty to rare instances and outliers. And I think people are right. If they're talking about that type of thing, that would be a lot of work to understand the variables and how they impact each other before you can act on that. The other approach that they suggest is that we can acknowledge that complexity means we're fallible. We don't know everything. We won't know everything perfectly. And so we can choose a different path. Instead of trying to model the system to the smallest degree possible, what we can do is visualize enough of the system to be able to act, which is the approach that we're going to focus on today. I'm like, okay, cool. The other thing that talks about when you try to map reality is, personally, this is just my personal preferences, but I think some people do find it helpful. But personally, I think about if we try to map reality exactly, even if I just try to map like my family circle, I feel like that is so complex that doesn't really get me anywhere. The General McChrystal talks about this is where they tried to map the American military strategy. And he said, when we understand that slide, we will have won the war. Because it would take a lot of work just to try to understand that slide in order to take an action based on that understanding. Whereas the approach that I've been using and learning about is more, you don't have the illusion of control in it. Rather, you have sort of the idea of you just want to understand and map enough and rally enough people around the problem that you take an action that has a higher chance of working than not. And again, even in that, you don't just do one experiment like the design thinking approach. You don't just build one MVP. You actually build a few different experiments and test those against each other and understand the impacts on a smaller scale before you you expand the experiment. Anyway, so we're going to break out into rooms again. We want you to pick a topic out of mental health, journalism, and food waste. But feel free to come up with your own topic. There's no sort of right or wrong here. We want you to write down everything you believe is related to this problem. So that could be like people, organizations, systems, rules and policies, government, whatever it is you can think of, and then start trying to understand the connections and assumptions or hypotheses about the connections between the different elements. Okay, and I'll post a few different examples as photos into the Miro board as well, so you've got some idea of what you're trying to create. But we'll have about 20 minutes for this one. We might just finish 5 minutes late just to give a bit more time to open the teams. Hello, welcome back. We're going to be very quick to finish off, so everyone can go about their day on. How did everyone go? Any thoughts or feedback? Keen to hear, how that felt, your insights and stories out of that.
I had a flashback to my boot camp. We were like activities like this. I found value in the exercise just because it helps you really, I would say, go into detail and make connections that you wouldn't think about, and doing that can actually help your thinking or your process. We chose food waste. So like everybody has their own experience with the problem. So seeing other people's ideas and how you can connect your thoughts and ideas with theirs. So that was pretty cool. So like for our activity, it was a range of players, whether it's agribusiness, people who manufacture plastic, stuff like that. So it was just really interesting to participate.
Yeah, awesome. That's good. That's good to hear, Jeff. Glad you found value from it. And hopefully it wasn't a PTSD type flashback from your bootcamp. Awesome. Who else wants to go?
Sure. So we did journalism, which was interesting because we started like talking about all the obvious things. And then as we went on, like people started going, oh, what about like the news cycle? And just really building off of each other. It was really helpful to get a broad perspective.
Awesome. You had some comments about Rupert Murdoch as well that we're not going to share out loud. Cool. Any other thoughts? Helen, do you want to share your thoughts?
I was part of Jeffrey's group with the food waste. Can totally go on forever with that, to be really honest. I thought it was really fun to be able to play on other people's like topics or like what they bring to the table, and then just bursts of new like avenues and stuff. And I didn't even really get to talk about other things like health. How does food waste might lead to health issues as well as environmental impact with other communities, that kind of touching on the Hurricane Katrina situation too, like the ripple effect of maybe perhaps a landfill affecting those who live by them, things like that. Didn't even get to go that far, but
Awesome.
This is a fun exercise.
That's good. I'm glad to hear. Melissa?
No, it was okay. Okay, it's okay.
It is hard. Yeah, it takes a while, I think as human beings, we like certainty and reducing risk. And so when we spend the time to unpack something so complex, I think it goes against our nature a bit. All right, awesome. So we're gonna just close out with a few things. So it'd be good to get your feedback on the board, or if you want to share your feedback out loud as well, it'd be good to hear you say it in your own words. So just 3 questions. What are the things you appreciated or liked about our session? What's one thing we can improve or add? And then a rating out of 10 and what would make it a 10 for you next time. So feel free to, either put it on Miro or just share out loud.
I liked the interactive aspect of this session. I think it's more engaging this way. The only thing I guess I would have as constructive feedback is going on to the Miro board was a little confusing. And I think it definitely, a lot of complex thinking, maybe not as much, but I like the exercises, but it was a little hard to know where I was supposed to go at first. But everything outside of that, I completely love. A+.
Awesome.
For me, I think it's been awesome. coming into the session, I was a little bit lost from the beginning. I think a little bit more like explanation for the newbies, so everyone is sort of carried along. Because from the first exercise, we're a little bit more confused, but we caught up. And the second exercise was super awesome and super interesting. I love how interactive this session was, and it's been awesome. Rating out of 10, I think I would give it an 8, a 7.5 for an 8.
Awesome. Thanks, Moses. It's good to have you. And yeah, we'll next time we'll definitely try to have a quick debrief for the newbies, like you say, so that everyone's on the same page. Also, there's not a lot of post-it notes. I don't know if that's a good or bad sign. The miracle.
I just didn't want to sound redundant. Agreed with everything Moses said. And I don't know if you want to hear that again, but his feedback was valid. For me, it was the same thing, an introduction into what, not an introduction, but just like a more of an explanation of what we're talking about. So like for the complex thinking methodology, like maybe briefly like what that is, because I guess we're all at different levels and stuff like that. But yeah, I don't want you to get the impression that people don't want to learn new things or anything like that. I learned a new word today that was interesting and stuff like that. But yeah, that would probably for me be the only thing that makes it a 10, would be having that little brief introduction.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff, for echoing those words and adding your experience on top as well. We'll definitely do that next time then. All right, awesome. Just to close out, obviously, if you want to come to our next session, so we run sessions weekly. You can just sign up to Design for Impact and you'll get access to our sessions and our Slack community as well. These are some of the nice people that you'll see, smiley people that you'll see. And we've got a referral program as well. We just started the referral program just to help grow our community and increase our diversity. So yeah, feel free to let people that you think might be interested in this know as well. Anyone have any questions or thoughts before we close out? Thanks so much. I think it was awesome to see like a group of 30 or so participants, complete randoms, most of us, and yeah, the sort of work that you did together in terms of the maps and things like that, and just hearing your reflections. I think, where do we sign up? I'll paste the website here, Moses. Hopefully that's a bit easier. So it's just designforimpact.co. Awesome. And last thing is, next week we're going to be exploring intervention points in complex systems. So how do you actually start to think about like where you can intervene in a complex system rather than just the whole idea of analysis paralysis. So that's what we're going to be focusing next time. If you want to sign up, just sign up on our website and we'll send you an email for the link. Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it and see you next week.
Thank you. See you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.